Hi, Professor Dyer here, talking about the history of human development and family science. I'm going to use the history of my own academic department at the California State University, Fresno, known as Fresno State, to illustrate the bigger story of how the discipline of human development and family science developed over time. I'm going to call these departments Human Development and Family Science, or HDFS, because that is the most widely used name. But please note that there is no universally agreed upon name for departments like this. In fact, here at Fresno State, our department is called Child and Family Science, and there are many other names in use as well. HDFS is an interdisciplinary field of study, meaning it combines scholarship from multiple disciplines if that scholarship is relevant to a particular subject matter. In our case, the subject matter is human development and family relationships. We primarily combine developmental science, which emerged as part of psychology in the 1890s, and family science, which emerged as a subdiscipline of sociology in the 1910s with home economics. Let's start with home economics because that's how our department started here at Fresno State. Home economics functioned like an umbrella discipline. Several subdisciplines existed under the name of home economics. The specific group of subdisciplines under the umbrella changed over time, expanding at some points in history and contracting at other points in history. What all of the subject areas had in common, however, was that they prioritized the life and work of ordinary people, including especially women, who up to this point had been, for the most part, excluded from higher education, both as students and as scholars, and whose lives had been ignored by scholars as, inconsequential or uninteresting or something. The early home economists argued that the lives of women were important enough to be studied, that science could improve women's lives, and that women scientists could, in fact, do this work. Somewhat paradoxically, home economics both valued the work of women in the home and also aimed to reduce the drudgery of that work in order to free women to do other things in the broader society. In the early years, home economics consisted of domestic sciences as well as domestic arts. Women who were trained in chemistry, such as the founder of home economics, Ellen Richards, applied that expertise to food and nutrition in the home. These were sometimes called domestic sciences, and these areas of study later became food science, nutrition, and dietetics. Scientists like Richards were joined by women who specialized in what might be called the domestic arts, such as textiles, sewing, and interior decorating. Today, these disciplines have transformed into fashion merchandising and interior design. Home economics, therefore, combined both sciences and arts. There were three forces that really created home economics as an academic discipline around the turn of the 20th century. First was the expansion of higher education, specifically the research university in America. Previously, colleges had been designed to provide a liberal arts education for sons of the wealthy and ruling class. But around the turn of the century, public education was widely embraced and seen as a resource that could serve society at large. This was true of K-12 education and higher education. Furthermore, the research university came to America. In a research university, as opposed to a college, knowledge was divided into academic disciplines, and professors could specialize rather than having to know a little bit about everything. Professors became producers of new knowledge, not solely teachers, and they were organized into academic departments. This made room for new disciplines in higher ed, new areas of expertise. Many of the social sciences emerged at this time. The Morrill Act of 1862 established at least one public university in every state by providing land grants for the purpose. Land grant universities were set up to teach the so-called practical arts, such as agriculture and engineering, and to open college enrollment to ordinary people, not just the elite. Very often, land grants even allowed women to enroll. The Morrill Act is known for democratizing higher ed in the United States, although it did so by exploiting land confiscated from Native American tribes. The Morrill Act was extended in 1890 to create the historically black colleges in former Confederate states, and it was extended again in 1914, at that time naming home economics as a vocational discipline that would receive funding through agriculture in land-grant universities. This gave a big boost to home economics by providing a funding stream for it. But it also created a link between home economics and agriculture, and it classified home economics as vocational training. These things will have both good and bad consequences for home ec. When Fresno State was founded in 1911, it was not a land-grant university, but it was a normal school. That is, it was a school designed to prepare teachers. There were only 13 faculty that first year at Fresno State, one of whom was a home economist. The expansion of public education is why normal schools were even necessary. America desperately needed teachers to staff all of those new public schools. And training teachers who would teach home economics in the high schools, that was part of the mission. The second force that created home economics was misogyny in higher ed. Women were largely excluded from higher education, both as students and as faculty. A few private liberal arts colleges exclusively for women appeared on the East Coast in the late 19th century, and these started to produce women with college degrees. But those women had very limited options for academic work. Were it not for the typical exclusion of women from higher ed, the few female scholars would have simply worked in the disciplines in which they had been trained. But for most, this was not an option. They were shut out. Therefore, female scholars were forced to create a new space for themselves in higher ed. And men in higher ed sometimes went along with this in order to keep the women all contained in one place. Therefore, home economics departments simultaneously gave women a place in higher education, but also kept them segregated from mainstream higher education. The impact of female scientists being excluded from their own disciplines. This was apparent at Fresno State, where the early home economics curriculum at Fresno State heavily emphasized the natural sciences. In 1916, the Fresno State catalog shows that 5 chemistry classes were offered in the Department of Home Economics, along with a bacteriology class. And by 1920, there was another biology class and a household physics class offered in the Department of Home Economics. This curriculum was heavily science-oriented, which was typical of home economics. The final force that created home economics was the social reform movement called progressivism. Progressivism emerged around the turn of the 20th century with the goal of addressing social problems related to industrialization, immigration, urbanization, factors that were all transforming American society after the Civil War. Progressivist reformers sought to reduce corruption in government and in big business. They fought to end child labor, to promote gender equality, including the right to vote for women. Progressivists championed the rights of workers, and they promoted collective action for the well-being of all. Home economics was part of the progressivist movement. The early home economists, for instance, created school lunch programs in American schools. They invented the food pyramid to educate the public about healthy eating. They worked in settlement houses to help immigrant families find work and housing. They founded the Head Start early intervention program. Early home economics was progressivist and feminist. All of this was illustrated here at Fresno State. One of our earliest faculty members, Cora Burdick, came to Fresno State from a job at the famous Hull House, the settlement house in Chicago founded by Jane Addams to serve immigrant families. The women who ran home economics at Fresno State, and yes, they were all women, were social reformers with serious academic credentials. Unfortunately, over time, that feminist, progressivist, and scientific origin of home ec faded, both nationally and here at Fresno State. Physical science classes were largely abandoned. The curriculum started to focus on training women to be homemakers in their private homes, rather than training them to be members of a workforce with a social reform agenda. This was reflected here at Fresno State. In 1931, our department actually changed its name to homemaking. Cringe. Science classes were gone from the curriculum. There were new classes related to the management of private family homes. And around this time, our department created a, quote, model apartment where students could learn things like housekeeping and social etiquette for entertaining. Ugh. This trend continued nationwide through the Great Depression and World War II. After the struggles of 2 world wars and a devastating economic depression, Americans seemed to pine for an imagined past that was maybe simpler. Part of this nostalgia meant embracing the concept of separate spheres for men and women, imagining that men belonged in the public sphere, in the workplace and in politics, while women belonged in the private sphere that included the home and the family. It seems that the work of the early feminists, of the progressivist reformers, and the early home economists was completely reversed by about 1950. The new home economics, which is what most of us think of when we hear home economics, was all about teaching girls to cook and clean and sew so that they could be a good housewife. It was being used as a tool to promote gender ideologies that people imagined were traditional. In fact, the 1950s were not at all traditional. They were very unusual. And we would snap out of this delusional nostalgia by the social upheavals of the 1960s. But before we get there, the 1950s was also a time of tremendous expansion of higher education in the United States. And ironically, a time when more women were going to college than ever before. About half of the women who earned college degrees in the 1950s earned those degrees in home economics. So the discipline was booming in terms of number of students. But it had largely abandoned its feminist and progressivist origins and was starting to lose academic and cultural credibility. Betty Friedan famously accused home economics of creating the myth of the happy housewife. I disagree with her that home economics created that myth, but home economics certainly did much to support that myth in the 1950s. Now, there were efforts within home ec to correct course, to return to our progressivist origins, but the great paradox of home economics is that it was considered too feminist for people who wanted to keep women out of college and out of the workforce entirely, but at the same time, it was not feminist enough for those who wanted to entirely liberate women from the home and from family obligations. So in short, it had enemies on all sides. At Fresno State, we did change our name back to home economics in 1942, but we never brought back the science classes. And when the university divided itself into divisions, of what we now call colleges, back in 1952, home economics was placed in the division of fine and practical arts. We were apparently no longer considered a science, but an art. It was a total transformation from our origins. You might be thinking, so far, we haven't said much about the study of children and families. Those disciplines were not initially under the umbrella of home economics. Developmental science had been created by psychologists as something called the child study movement in the 1890s. Those developmental psychologists were studying children in the laboratory environment, what Uri Bronfenbrenner would later criticize as, quote, the science of the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. Those psychologists who were interested in studying children in their natural contexts and with a more applied focus tended to separate themselves gradually from psychology departments. They also started to study development across other age groups, not just childhood. Today we call this human development or developmental science. Family science had emerged as part of empirical sociology in the early 1900s, although it was interdisciplinary from the very start, with influence of anthropology and social work and others. Early on, there was a focus on the study of marriage. The study of parenting began a bit later in the 1950s. Much of the early family science research was applied in nature. So both developmental science and family science were developing independently, but the connection to home economics felt natural. Students in home economics programs typically said they wanted coursework about children, parenting, family relationships, and home economics leadership started to pursue connections to these disciplines as early as the 1920s. By about the 1940s, these disciplines had, at least in part, come under the home economics umbrella. At Fresno State, we first offered a child development course and a marriage and family course in 1947. Classes on nursery school education followed by 1949. We started a nursery school on campus, what is now Programs for Children, in order to train home economics students to become preschool teachers. It was around this time that Fresno State outgrew its campus home just north of downtown. That original campus is now the home of Fresno City College, and moved to a new, much larger campus located far out of town on Shaw Avenue. And that is where we remain to this day. The home economics department was quite large at the time. This was 1956, and was one of the first programs to get a new building of its own on the new campus. The new building contained a child study classroom in order to continue training preschool teachers. It is today part of Programs for Children. And we replaced our practice apartment with a home management house, a little 1950s style suburban house built directly on campus. It is still tucked in between the dorms and the residence dining hall. Today it's used as another site belonging to Programs for Children. The department continued to grow in Fresno, especially in the child and family area. We added a course called The Child and the Family in 1961. The department hired its first male faculty member in the child and family area in 1966. New classes about children and families started to appear regularly. Dynamics of Family Relations in 1965, Preparation for Marriage, Family Relationships, and Child Development Practicum, all in 1968. 1971 saw new classes called Children and Family Crises, that is now our Risk and Resilience class, and Cultural Aspects of Child Rearing, that's now our Culture and Diversity class. Our Adolescence class appeared in 1975, and our Parenting class arrived in 1976. Nationally, home economics had thoroughly lost its credibility by the 1960s. Home economics departments were being dismantled and renamed. Home ec at UC Berkeley, for instance, which was California's original land-grant institution, was dismantled. A Department of Nutrition was allowed to remain at UC Berkeley, but all other vestiges of home economics were eliminated. Home economics was seen as something of an embarrassment to the prestigious land-grant and research-oriented universities. At Fresno State, in a misguided attempt to reclaim the cultural authority that home economics once had, when it was aligned with agriculture and land-grant universities, the home economics department moved into the College of Agriculture in 1978. But this did not help. In fact, a very short time later, in 1981, food science and nutrition left to become its own department. It was, at the time, the largest sub-discipline under the home economics umbrella, so its departure changed the nature of the department completely. Interior design also left to join the art department, and within 10 years, our department had abandoned the home economics identity, becoming Child, Family, and Consumer Sciences in 1991. In the 1990s and early 2000s, our department filled with developmental scientists, some of whom had expertise in early childhood education. The child focus became critical among our faculty and in our curriculum. Soon, all of our faculty were also researchers, emphasizing the science that had earlier characterized home economics. Currently, we've hired a few more family science faculty, so the focus is shifting a bit in that direction. But many of us see the connection between developmental science and family science as integral to our work, so we embrace the interdisciplinarity of HDFS. The consumer science area gradually faded over time, not attracting new students and eventually losing its faculty to retirement. Clothing construction grew less relevant as people stopped producing their own clothing, and it was replaced with fashion merchandising, which moved into the School of Business in 2018. At that point, Child and Family was the only area left in the department that had once been home economics. We changed our name to Child and Family Science. We moved out of agriculture and into the College of Social Sciences in 2020. HDFS, therefore, inherited the home ec department because it was the only discipline that was left. All of the others grew up and left home, you might say. We were the newest addition. Everyone else moved out, and we were still here. But this is a legacy that we treasure. Here's what I think are the two most important lessons of this history. One, we were founded as part of a feminist and progressivist and scientific mission to reform society. We are agents of social change. We challenge the status quo. We make changes that matter. Secondly, we are fundamentally interdisciplinary, relying on scholarship from many disciplines. The topics themselves change over time, but what it all has in common is that HDFS applies the methods of science to the everyday lives of ordinary people. I think these two lessons really sum up our identity, and I think this is one to be proud of. Thank you for taking this tour with me through the history of human development and family science.